So welcome to Sweeny versus Bard with Hamelryck. Today we're going to talk about Tantra. It's our third and final episode. And the first topic and the overarching theme today is fake Tantra. I mean, what is real Tantra? What is fake Tantra? What is real Sutra? What is fake Sutra? And how do we know when Tantra is really Tantra and is not just some New Age jargon? And how do we and also maybe the dialectic between Tantra and Sutra, we can go into that in more detail. So Alexander, do you want to jump in? And
yeah, I think I should. We have a lot of requests. And one of the most prominent ones are we haven't really discussed Indian or Chinese Tantra. We'd stay with the Tibetan and speculated on the Persian tradition. That's what we've done. So since I'm reasonably well, learned on Kashmiri Shaivism, which I think is what people most associate with Hindu Tantra, especially the monist version, which is also then the version that is closest to Tibetan and Persian Tantra. I think it could pay off to maybe take a look at that first. It has a strong sexual component, and the strong sexual component, so it's very similar to yin and yang, right? In that the strong sexual component is Shiva and Shakti. So Shiva is the phallus, and Shakti is the matrix. So yes. Shiva is the guy, and Shakti is the she. She's the girl. So the way it works is that Shiva stands for consciousness in Shaivistic Tantra. And this is, of course, Shaivism means the worship of Shiva. So this is a separate cult within Hinduism where you worship the phallus. That's why all the Shiva temples have lingams everywhere around India. So it's very, very sexual, very explicitly sexual and phallic. And obviously this inspires the military, inspires, engineering and stuff that guys do. But the Shaivistic cult has its exact dialectical opponent as well, which is the cult of Shakti, and the cult of Shakti is at least as prominent in India as the cult of Shiva. So they're very intertwined one another. So they take yin and yang very seriously. They personify yin and yang compared to the Chinese, and then do them Shiva and Shakti as these characters. But the funny thing is that because Shiva is the only male character, he has to be consciousness. We talked a lot about how the Persians were adamant you must separate the priest and the king. So you separate the will to transcendence, which is royal, from the will to intelligence, which is priestly. And you keep them separate, especially if you're going to build large empires and make those empires work, which the Persians were very good at and the Indians were not. But in the Shiva cult, Shiva is all of these masculine attributes. So he becomes consciousness. And then the role of energy is thrown at Shakti. And this has to do with the fact that the triad in Hindu Tantra, the triad there, I think they're called Icha and Jnana and Kriya, which is the most famous one. And the Icha is will and desire. So anything that has, they think of will and desire as the same thing. Basically, you desire some things you cannot escape desire, because to not desire is in itself a desire. So you cannot escape desire. So it's one of the three forces, that the Icha. And then on top of the Icha comes the Jnana, which is knowledge.
Wisdom too. Yeah, it's also true.
Wisdom, yeah. Wisdom. Exactly. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing. Jnana, that's what it is. And the third one is Kriya. And the Kriya is the action. And this is where the Persians are different. It would be interesting to see what you guys say, since you're both Varayana. This is where the Persians are different from the Indians, because they add action as the third element, Kriya. Where Zoroaster, the Persians say, well, desire is action. It's its own form of action. Therefore, it's a will to transcendence, and therefore there's a will to intelligence. These are desires that are on the move. Everything is mobile. Everything is processual in Persian thinking. And the same thing, of course, goes with knowledge. Knowledge is not stale and fixed. Knowledge is something that's alive and on the move. And it's through a process that we know the world. It's through interactions with the world we know the world. So the Persians think they can afford to skip that element and get the action out of the way, which is the energy of Shakti. So all of a sudden, you realize that the difference between Persian and Indian Tantra is that Shakti is out of the way as an energy. And why is that? Where does the female then come back? When it comes back in a non-sexual sense, because, the Persians are adamant that the sexual realm can only be the third realm. The first realm must be the separation of the royal and the priestly. The second realm must be the separation of war and hunt. And the third one is the separation of man and woman. They put the yin and the yang third as a reward, as ritual at night, as the end of the entire, tribal experience. So the Persians would then say, okay, so we then only have two things here. We have a will, desire, and then we have a knowledge. And that's exactly what they then replicate in the Ahura and the Masta. And one of them, of course, is the will to transcendence. The other one is the will to knowledge. And they're both active. Will to knowledge is a priestly activity. It's not a fixed wisdom. It's not zeros and ones. It's alive. It's an activity. Mm-hmm. And the same thing goes with the chieftain or the king, who takes on the responsibility to will to transcendence, who personifies that there's more to this than what we can see today. There's a future to this, and the king's offspring will then lead us into the promised land, onto the next stage in our lives, and we pass it on. And this because the Persians accept death. And they accept death as shinavat, which actually literally means the bridge on which you'll be judged for your life. So the shinavat is your death, your personal death. Up to Chinavat, you aspire towards Harvatat, which is to live a complete and full life. And after you're dead, you aspire to pass on the Meditat, which means that once you're dead, the heritage you created and passed on to the next generation is even more meaningful to you because it's transcended to yourself. And this is where Persian Tantra works. It works with a matriarch. So it would be a totally different goddess if the Persians had a goddess. It would be a matriarch, an older woman, who you'd be responsible to for everything you've done during the day. You'd have a local chinavat every day. That's when you come back from the hunt or come back from the war, and you're responsible for your actions during the day. So what did you do to create an abundance that would impress the ladies? So the matriarch said, okay, you're right. You can take your dick out, you can go to the ritual, and you can fuck one of the girls that I've got it there. Because I'm in control of the girls, that's the matriarch is. She's in control of the women. And therefore they put the matriarch there. There's not this sexual realm, this sort of, the dick and the pussy and it's all fucking and all that in the tantric realm like it is in India. But in the Persian realm, this is reduced to, yes, it's a huge orgy, but it's a reward at night when the men have done what they were supposed to do and they've delivered to the matriarch, and the matriarch says, okay, I'm ready to open the door to my daughters. Here we go, and got the ritual. So this is why there's a difference between the Kashmiri Shaivism, although it's monist, and Zoroastrianism in itself, which is also monist, and there's only the Hindu Kush in between the two. What the Zoroastrians decided to do was to develop a full imperial religion, whereas the Kashmiri Shaivists, who I admire a lot, decided to go for complete Tantra, Tantric exercise. You go to Tantric monasteries, but you live within the community of other people. Mm-hmm. That I would say is the difference. Does this make sense to you guys?
Well, there's a few differences, like, from what I know about these, so in the Hindu tradition, I know there's karma yoga, which is work. I guess that corresponds to what you were saying about action. So karma yoga is liberation through work, and jnana yoga is liberation through wisdom, through study, through intellectual practice, and then bhakti yoga is devotional love for the master, which is tends to be very feminine, even if men are doing it as well. It's very, very flowery and devotional and full of poetry. And also the other thing,
that's correct. It makes sense. It's not that it's a bad worldview or anything. It makes sense. It makes sense to divide yourself into these three different realms. Sure. The only thing the Persians basically did was that they said, well, since everything is activity anyway, and everything you practice is activity, and everything you learn is supposed to be instant activity, and you learn through activity, there's no point in making action one of the three, which enabled the Persians to think that they could replace that third triad with another one. And this leads into Judaism. Mm-hmm. What you then get is that it's called the Trika, right? The Trika in Sanskrit. So the Indian Trika becomes the Persian Trika. And when the matriarch replaces Shakti as this fancy idea of this beautiful sex goddess, right? And she's moved out because the sex goddess becomes a lower goddess because a higher goddess is obviously the matriarch. Yeah. And that leads to constructions like empires and nations. And that's what Judaism takes on, where you got Moses and Aaron and Miriam walking out of Egypt. Miriam is not a Shakti.
Yeah. Well, they're
siblings. They're siblings. Yeah. And they are the bastions of the community.
This is historical, sociological, discussion. What I know about Shakti and Shiva is these are elemental forces, right? And they're embedded in everything, and that's what it's about. It's like and it's also Krishna and Radha, and they're not old or young. They're usually 16. They're all the tantric deities are 16 years old because they're pure energy, right? And that's the age of this pure energy. So there's no matriarchal or patriarchal figure in that sense. So that's a little bit different, perhaps.
Yeah, because it is pure Tantra, and that makes sense because it's not Tantra and Sutra, whereas the Persian and the Jewish ideas here need to be both.
Right.
So they need to have a continuous narrative. So you go from Sutra to Tantra, but rather in India, which is a very settled culture. You have to remember that when you come to India, the first thing that strikes you is that these guys have been settled there for 5,000 years. Yeah. Southern India is a place where nobody's moved around. They were the first guys to skip out on nomadism, kept nomadology as a religion, but they never moved. That makes India distinctive.
There's also Krishna and the Gopis, which is kind of interesting. Because Krishna is this playing in the forest, and the Gopis they leave their jobs, they leave their occupations, they run off to be with Krishna, and so this is like symbolism of the many and the one and things like that. But also, there's the external aspect of that, which is you leave behind your desires and you go for the one. Right. And then there's the internal aspect of that, whereas actually Krishna and Radha are both inside of you. So the masculine and feminine is inside of you. Like you're both masculine and feminine. In the yogic process, you're supposed to be fully masculine and fully feminine. Like it's not like you're and so the more masculine you become, the more you invite the feminine. And does that make any sense?
Yeah, that rhymes with the Shavi Shakti opposition as well.
Yeah.
So how does this relate to Vajrayana, if I ask you guys, especially Thomas?
Oh, well, can I just say before Thomas speaks, because this is just on the thread I'm going, is that, again, Tibetan Buddhism is very much, as you say, it's a phallic thing. It was very male-oriented, and there's not much sexuality. There's iconography and stuff, but it's extremely monastic, and you would find the sexy things in sort of hidden away in very isolated places. But Bengalese Tantra, where all of the Tibetan lineages come from Bengal, this is what I'm learning. And that was much more mixed with Shaivism and much more mixed with Hinduism, and it was much more sexy and poetic and artistic and cosmopolitan. And that's where all the tantric lineages from Tibet come from, except one, which is called.
They claim they do.
Well, this is what I'm told.
Not so sure.
This is what I'm told. This is what I'm told.
I think a good place to start, at least in our research, is to actually place this somewhere either in the Swat Valley or northern Pakistan, which is stunningly beautiful, by the way. I mean, if you build a monastery anywhere in the world, the Swat Valley is exactly where you want to go. Think north of Peshawar, up towards the border of Afghanistan. It's beautiful. And then across the mountains from there, you come to Tajikistan. And Tajikistan obviously is mentioned all the time in Tibetan mythology as, this sacred
But that's
land.
where the Mahat cities come from, the 108 Mahat cities.
The Padmasambhava comes literally from Tajikistan. He is a Persian. We discussed that the last time.
But they're prior to Padmasambhava, there's the 108 Mahat cities who are semi-mythical. But, these traditions are often, they say they come from there, and that's on the borderland between Tibet and India. It's like on the...
Yeah. But just
like
be
in
careful.
This very sort of mixed culture where there's there's jungle and there's also mountain, and apparently it's a very extremely rich ecosystem. And there was a time when there was this like sort of incredible culture there in between the 8th and the 12th century.
Yeah, but you can go. You can
the Tantra in Tibet.
Yeah, but you can go to India and you can try to find traces of Padmasambhava. You'll find nothing. You can go to India, try to find traces of Bodhidharma. You find nothing. Bodhidharma was a Sogdian trader. He came from contemporary Afghanistan. He was a Persian trader, and the same thing goes with Padmasambhava, who is clearly a Persian, most likely Tajik, you would say today, which is Eastern Persian. And this is why I get so fascinated with the similarities between Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Shaivism. It's just striking how the patterns are similar, and how when they do switch these patterns, it is because you need to get out of the reincarnation thing. You need to solve that problem. If you become a Jainist and you radically just accept reincarnation forever, and you can't even kill yourself or anything because it just returns and it returns and it returns and it returns, or you just accept, or you just try to find a way out, which is the proper Buddhist way, or you make something out of the small difference that exists, which is the Zoroastrian attempt. Mm-hmm. And here is the difference between Shaivism and Zoroastrianism, if I may say so. It's that they both obviously go into the tantric. There's sexual tantra, there's certain experimental tantra with drugs, more so in Central Asia than India because they had access to more fun drugs. Central Asia was almost a powerhouse on a par with Peru and Mexico back in the days. India was not.
That's
India had
Soma, right? Which completely disappeared, or was it called
No,
Soma?
Soma is everywhere in India, but the Soma in India is basically just cannabis and opium. What else do you have? Whereas the Homa, which is Persian, the Homa in Central Asia was like, God, they had so many drugs they threw into their mixes, like 8, 10 of them, you know. So, they probably had a better tantric pharmacology simply because they had more resources. And the same thing comes to the tantric philosophy. And that's what I'm talking about here is that what do you prioritize? It's not that one of them is wrong. It's more like, which one of the trikas are you going to end up with eventually? And in what way will the trika then be something you can implement in your tantric practice?
So Thomas, any thoughts or?
Not immediately. I mean, they seem to be very interesting hypotheses, but so to what extent is this corroborated with, you know, documents and anthropological research, and to what extent is this a hunch? I mean, I'm a bit.
Okay, so Abhinavagupta is like Abhinavagupta a little more than 1,000 years ago. He's like, some people claim he's the Nietzsche of India. He was a radical monist. He did tons of practices, and he founded Kashmiri Shaivism. Although it was spread all over India very quickly, but you know, it's attributed to Kashmir because there were a lot of monasteries in Kashmir. So that was Shaivism, and this is the phallus cult of Hinduism. And there's Shiva and there's Vishnu, but the Shiva cult is much more the warrior cult, so the real phallic cult, whereas the Vishnu cult is more the upholder, the maintenance god of the three major deities of Hinduism. So Abhinavagupta set this up, and what then happened was that a lot of Kashmiri Shaivism, at least on the surface, more or less disappeared until the 20th century when what's his name again? Rashman Jo came along. I think his name is Lakshman Jo. Swami Lakshman Jo came along. And he, of course, inspired, you know, everything we know. He inspired TM, Transcendental Meditation. He inspired Ravi Shankar. He inspired Osho, certainly. Osho loved him.
Yeah, but that's not what I mean. I mean, it's like, so you have this theory about the different trikas and then the link to Zoroastrianism and stuff like that. So to what extent is this kind of hunch that you have? To what extent is this based?
No. I'm just saying the similarities are striking. So the Kashmiri Shaivist Trika you work with is this one, and it's the reduced to tantric sexuality as primary tantric practice with Shiva and Shakti. And then Shakti personifies energy and Shiva personifies consciousness, which I think a lot of women would find a bit degrading, because in Zoroastrianism, energy is youth and wisdom is old age. That's another vertical. That's not a horizontal comparison. You cannot put masculine and feminine into the categories of consciousness and energy. But that's what you have to do if you're going to make it primary. The point is that if the guy has delivered an abundance and the woman delivers generosity into the bedroom during a ritual, that to me makes a lot more sense. That's why I, of course, favor the Zoroastrian version of these things, because I think sexuality should be put in the third category as the reward system kicks in late at night and things like that. It just makes much more sense, because otherwise what you do when you, in Taoism, put the yin and yang first, or in Shaivism, you put Shiva and Shakti first, is that by making that, you leave the rest of religion to other ideas. So you introduce Confucius.
You're positing a certain. So let's take it back to Girard for a change. So here Girard thinks of ritual as let's say as organized murder, right? So you pick a scapegoat. That's the old story. Pick a scapegoat, kill the scapegoat. And that way you relieve tension in the tribes, right? So Girard would say that all myth and all ritual goes back to that. So what you're now saying, you're talking about a ritual that is different in nature. You're talking about sexual ritual.
Yeah,
so
lynch mob and sexual ritual are different rituals.
To what extent is that sexual ritual different from Girardian, or is that compatible with Girardian ritual? Is this are you positing a different type of
I'm
ritual?
sure there are overlaps. I'm sure if we storm into the next village and kill all the men of the village and rape all their daughters, then that's somewhere between lynch mob and sexual ritual, and that's what happens during war. So these are powers that are very related. I always say sex and violence should always be compared and kept close. That's the way they function, but they're not the same thing. The violent ritual, the sexual ritual are not the same thing.
To put it perhaps in a different way, right? You know, in the tantric ritual, in the springtime, you worship the red goddess who's vibrant and sexual, and it's just life in its most dynamic form. And that's the new moon in April. And in in October the full moon in April. In October, in the new moon, you worship this destructive, wrathful thing which destroys everything. So, you know, there's this destructive force, and that's part of the ritual, right? Which happens in October, and then there's this spring ritual where you that's, I guess, where you would have, if you want to talk about sex, maybe that would be when you would have sex. I don't know, but that would be the fullness, the explosion of sensuality in spring, and then the destruction and the emptying out in October before the winter season before. So it's emptiness and form again, which is the theme throughout all of Buddhism. There's
well, Girard doesn't write much about sexual ritual.
I think Girard would.
He's a good Catholic.
He speaks more about this destructive aspect of ritual, but he doesn't have he doesn't have a Nietzschean, you could say, life affirming, because we talked about that last time, view of ritual. He doesn't acknowledge that, or maybe he does. Maybe I'm wrong, but
acknowledge it, that it's because the alternative is extinction, right? You need something to channel violence. So without ritual, humanity wouldn't exist. Basically, animals became humans through mimesis, and at the same time that mimesis emerged, ritual and religion had to emerge in order to neutralize the dangerous aspects of mimesis, namely competition and violence of all against all. So, this is because now Alexander talks about other types of rituals. So rituals that are centered around sexuality, and that would be a very different type of ritual than what Girard talks about, because he sees scapegoating as the sole reason why you would have a ritual, to streamline the scapegoating, right? To avoid a war of all against all. But are there
it's what to do with the passions, right? It's what we do with the passions.
And violence. There's, of course, this very close link between these two. But were they then decoupled, and were there societies or tribes that were based on successful sexual rituals and not on rituals that go back to scapegoating? Because you've actually put a really big idea there, right?
Yeah. Okay, let's take it this way. Say you're a nomadic tribe. You'd have to more or less constantly be on the move to survive. And that's how you managed to live for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, do you want your young girls to be pregnant now and then throughout the year? Or do you think it benefits you better if you can actually focus and concentrate sexuality at certain points in time, and therefore, for example, have as many girls as possible give birth when you're in a specific place during the year, but then refrain from that the rest of the year? That is precisely why there is castration. And this is where the Freudian element that I can't find in Girard, but I certainly find in Freud, is that these things need to be controlled. So sexuality needs to be tamed. And what Girard then beautifully does is that he complements that with something that's lacking from, which is how you contain violence. Both sex and violence are incredible strong forces. Yeah. And you cannot deal with them until you go tantric. Within the sutric, you basically you stay within the rules. So the sutric teaching, you'll be taught, these are the rules, and don't you dare do anything outside of these rules, because they will probably kill you. You stay within these rules, because sexuality and violence are such strong forces that need to be contained. And the reason you need to contain, so say why are there older women to begin with? Number one, they probably take care of the babies that are born. Daycare centers are more human than nuclear families are, because older women, we know for a fact that women who have grandchildren live longer than the women who don't, just out of that simple fact. So, but one of the older women, certainly one of the older women, who then would be the midwife or something very ceremonial like that. So she would be in charge of births when the births are happening. So there'd be a huge birth ceremony, probably say, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, that would be something more like in March every year, Whereas during midsummer, you have a pagan festivity, and then you fuck a lot, and then obviously you have a lot of young women who get pregnant. And if a lot of women sit together, have conversations, they fall into the same menstruation cycles. That is obviously a biological evolutionary fact. So all these things point to that there needs to be a matriarch. There needs to be a matriarch who is in control. She's the brothel madam. She keeps the key to the brothel, and she makes sure that her daughter's locked in there. But when you've convinced her that you've done your job as a man, you created the abundance you promised you would create, then she opens the door and you're ready for the sexual ritual. Then when you get all these ideas together, you get the nomadological version of how sexuality is contained within a society. This is why sexuality is surrounded with all these little minuscule rules, because otherwise it will run amok, it'd be a mess. And that's why the girl who goes out into the forest and starts fucking around anything she likes, she's basically torn apart, and she's certainly a female scapegoat, and she will be killed in no time at all by the other women, because she's broken the rules. And if you break the rules, then you should be dead. You're dangerous to everybody. You put everybody in a really unsafe spot if you do that. So I think sexual ritual and violent ritual are the two categories we should talk about, and they're closely related. And why not? If they both need to be contained, and if young men and young women need to be taught that they don't know these things yet, so they're given laws or rules that they must abide by, but they can possibly, if they're clever enough later in life, go through the tantric, go past through the Bard Absolute to become
I have
tantric,
another
where they can enjoy it better. Yeah.
Slight objection to that is that we talked about in the last thing, we talked about the 9 yanas, right? There's Buddhism, this sort of progressive stages that you all go through. But it's not like you get to the 9 yana when you're old. You could get to the 9 yana when you're 20. You could get to the 9 yana. It's not like it's not a sociological thing. It's about realization. It's about realizing something. It's about understanding and integrating the whole thing. So it's not just it's not a life stages thing necessarily, because
no, but I think it was
Andrew.
I think I talked about the nomadic tribe, the Sasyant here, and I think the Sasyant, that was certainly the case. The best way just to, because everybody knew everybody. It wasn't larger than at max 1,200 people, probably more like a few hundred. So you would know everybody within your own tribe, your own Sasyant. And therefore, I think the elders had enormous respect tied to them. And this is what the Persians play with when the Persians create an imperial order. So it has to go sutric. They basically take tantric teaching, which is Taoism, which is Shaivism, and then said, what if we do this and then implement it in a way we can actually make sense for the entire imperial order? And that is when I think they take the sex goddess out of the equation and put the proper matriarch back into the picture. And that's when you get a different Trika. That's what you get. So
well, that strikes me as exoteric rather than esoteric. And the esoteric tradition is much less kind of like linear stages. And anyway.
It was more difficult for the Persians to maintain the tantric traditions than it was for the Tibetans and the Chinese and the Indians. That's a fact. They must have sacrificed something when they went imperial. Yeah.
The Persian Tantra. What's that?
Yes.
Does it have a name? I mean, is there?
Yeah. Okay. So the Indian name is.
I don't know anything about
the Indian name is Dhyana. The Persian name is Diana. The Chinese name is Shan, the Japanese name is Zen, and the Korean name is Zeon, and the Vietnamese name is Thien. So these are the Silk Road traditions of yogic and tantric practices. The specific tantric practice in India, in Persia, is called Tashramaiti. So the Tashramaiti is which is being rediscovered as we speak, because a lot of young Zoroastrians today are going to India and learning and discovering, oh, we have the same word in Avesta you had in Sanskrit, then probably the practice is very similar. So the practices themselves are, of course, very similar.
Well, I know that, like, I'm reading Irina Twitty right now, and she studied with a Sufi master who was Hindu at first, and then actually was actually his teacher was a Muslim, and so there's kind of, there is a, and then they're doing jhana yoga. So there is this sort. There's less of a fixed, boundary than we tend to think.
Oh, Sufism definitely kept it. We should certainly talk about a Sufi Tantra as well. But it's let's not extend ourselves too much outside of our own knowledge. But it's just the three of us here, after all, having this conversation. But yeah, I'm pretty. I've studied the 20th century Renaissance for the Shaivistic Tantric practices, which are the ones that I stick to in India anyway, and that I get inspiration from. And when I recommend my Persian friends to go to India, I say, go straight to the Kashmiri Shaivism thing, because you don't have a problem with dualism in it. It's strictly monist. Everything in the world is related to everything else. So this is exactly why Shiva and Shakti are two different expressions of the same thing, etc. So you get all these things that you could actually work with. That I think makes sense to Zoroastrians too. So Zoroastrians are adamant that they are the only eventological religion that is monist. It could be that Judaism could qualify for that too, because Judaism doesn't have the problem with eternal life and life after death, which is clearly a sign that you've accepted a dualist worldview, which Christianity and Islam are engaged with. So this is why Zoroastrianism today, from having been, in a relationship and a dialogue with Islam and Christianity for many hundreds of years, now is much more in dialogue with Taoism, Buddhism, Shaivism, and Eastern traditions, and it's now part of the Silk Road triad, which is Zoroastrianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. So this is where I'm at, totally. I think this is where all the richness and all the wealth of spiritual knowledge is located. So authentic versus fake when it comes to Tantra, and of course, when it comes to Sutra. What do you guys say? That's the main theme for today.
Authentic, yeah.
That's an interesting...
Yeah, I think authentic Tantra is quite rare, but there's also, I think we have to, this is what I was telling Thomas, and he kind of pushed back on me a little bit, but I think there's Neo Tantra and there's Tantra. And I think Neo Tantra is about dealing with your sex life and having a good sex life and sort of, having a lot of sex. That's Neo Tantra. And I think that the traditional Tantra sexuality is a huge part of it, but it's not the entire story. It's like it's a completely mythopoetic, artistic thing with thousands of different practices and deep traditions and all that. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I know that Thomas always pushes back on me a bit there. And so maybe, I don't know, if you want to push back on me, Thomas, about that?
Why not? Why not push back a bit?
I'm not against, and we have in this argument, and I'm not against the Neo Tantras. I think Osho's Neo Tantric movement was fantastic. I think his therapies, which I've done, the dynamic meditation, the Kundalini meditation, they're just great practices for people to become, more whole human beings. But whether they're genuine Tantra or not, well,
I'm sure there
is
are.
an element of genuine Tantra in Osho, definitely.
Absolutely. Maybe it's just that Lakshman Jo came up with this in the 20th century. I don't know how much of what Lakshman Jo taught that actually was 1,000 years old and how much he came up with, but certainly there was a Kashmiri Shaivist Renaissance in the 20th century, had enormous influence in India, and it turned out to be the serious version of the Indian Tantra that was exported to the West, and also did that well. Undoubtedly, he was a great teacher.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with Neo Tantra either.
No, I have zero problem with Neo Tantra. But Osho himself came up with that term to distinguish Tantra, which is like jhana and the deeper spiritual aspects of Tantra, from somebody once told me that Osho had 10 very serious students and about 1 million followers. So maybe that tells you something. I don't know.
I think you can always talk about authenticity in this case. You can always think of intention, and then you can think of foundation. So if you look at a teacher, for example, is this the real thing or not? Well, what is the teacher's intention? And then how much does this teacher actually know and has the capacity to practice and teach, So, which is the foundation. And when it comes to the intention, there are two different ditches you might fall into. It's either the message you hear is too flattering to be true, right? Mm-hmm. This guy is really good with the sales pitch, but there's not that much behind it. So that's a sign to watch out. And I'd say the two traps you fall into that is that either this is all too commercial, and this is that this guy's really out to make money, which at least when it comes to sutric practices is terrible. When it comes to tantric practice, it could actually be a good idea because it might be the way that he actually makes you believe what you're about to learn. Yeah. Chuck Lacan, for example, died rich.
Trump would say money, food, sex, and money. He wrote this article about that, and that's like.
Yeah, okay, but the other one is the other trap you might fall into is pretentiousness.
Yes.
And what I argue in our new book that I'm working with Jan Söderqvist, now we're going to go after the axial age, and the idea of the axial age was this golden age of ideas and everything. It was basically just like the internet today. It produced a lot of shit, but very little quality, to be honest about it. I prefer the Bronze Age, as you know. But to point out what was the problem with the axial age, the really overbearing problem with the axial age was that pretentiousness prospers when we're permanently settled and have abundance. So say you have a society that's been at peace for several hundred years. It's created enormous abundance. Everybody's well off. You know, people are getting obese and fat and lazy and decadent. Suddenly, the spiritual teachers become incredibly pretentious because they can afford to all of a sudden, because they don't really have to make their own living. They don't have to win a war. They don't ever have to hunt something down for a survival. They just sit there and they have a beggar's bowl in front of them and they can make up anything they like. So they become fat little pillar saints sitting in the forest, declaring that they're the center of the universe and the Messiah, whatever, without really working hard on anything. And that I think is the problem with these periods of peace, is that they produced a lot of material. They produced a lot of the scripts that we got left today to study. But actually, if you look at what really contributed to civilization as a whole, who invented and made things change forever in a radically new way that we could benefit from, it wasn't these pillar saints, it wasn't pretentiousness that did it. So I say commercialism and pretentiousness are two things you need to watch out for if you don't want to fall into the trap of a very flattering fake guru.
Mm-hmm. I'm waiting for Thomas to say something.
But he's probably the other guy. He's probably on the authentic when it comes to the teaching bit. Right, Thomas? You're allergic to people who don't know what they're talking about.
Well, you know, that can happen to everyone. No, so back to Neo Tantra and Tantra, right? Push back to Andrew Sweeny a bit. So there's a historian of Tantra, so he's an academic, a scholar, right? So this is not just somebody's opinion. What's his name again? He's called Jeffrey Samuel, I think. And so he basically also talks. So he talks about some point about Tantra and Neo Tantra, and Neo Tantra gets a lot of flack because it's, you know, it's a parody of the real Tantra, and it's commercial and it's dumbed down and this and that. And he finds that a very unproductive attitude. Because it's more productive and I think insightful to see Tantra as something that is spread, let's say, 1,500 years ago in Asia, and it's spread across many religions. You can find it in Jainism, in Buddhism, and Hinduism. So it seems to be another religion in itself, but something that kind of spreads across.
Like a meta religion. It's underneath a lot of religions. You can find Tantra somewhere hidden. I heard that like there was Tantric masters hiding and pretending to be Muslims in Iraq when the Americans invaded, and you know.
Well, I don't think these people are necessarily pretending to be Muslims. There is no contradiction between. You can be a Tantric Muslim, you can be a Tantric Christian.
Yeah, but they had to hide their practices from the the government.
Well, that depends on what these practices are, right?
Yeah.
So my point is, so Tantra is like an oil spill. It's something that can spread across religions, and now it has jumped over to the West, thanks to people like we mentioned Osho. So yeah, Osho is, I mean, that's the Bhagwan, right? So I knew him as the Bhagwan. You know, I'm old. I knew him as the Bhagwan, and he changed his name to Osho. So it took me some years to kind of figure out, like, oh, Osho and Bhagwan is the same thing. You know, bioterrorism, machine guns, and stuff like that. So very, very colorful. But there's of course another person who took Tantra to the West was, of course, Chogyam Trungpa. So I'm much more interested in Chogyam Trungpa than in Osho. And so he brought Vajrayana to the West in the 70s in America.
Oh, me too.
Very controversial teacher, a stiff drinker, used to give these hilarious talks while he was drinking water by the pints. And of course, the water was not water, but it was gin or vodka or something like that. So totally outrageous person. But anyway, that's another thing. But basically, so now we have this, now Tantra is basically spreading in the West. And we have, of course, all kinds of stuff going on. We have people who don't know what they're doing. We have commercialism. We have dumbed down Tantra. We have Tantra that has been stripped from everything controversial. We have Tantra that is almost like Sutra. We have Tantra that is essentially only hedonism. And that's a good thing. It's basically this big boiling pot of new technologies and new ideas that are spreading to the West. So that's why
I like your point. Yeah.
I understand your skepticism, right? With respect to Neo Tantra, and it's definitely I would definitely make a clear distinction between Vajrayanas taught by traditional lineage teachers and what other people are offering, right? But at the same time, it seems to be a very creative age. So I would say, like, well, try out stuff and fail, and the good things, they will survive, and stuff that doesn't work, stuff that doesn't make sense, that will disappear. That's a very Whiteheadian way of thinking, by the way. Bad stuff just doesn't stick around. So, and I think that Trungpa said something like, "Oh, Tantra in the West, that'll take something like 500 years." So also these Tibetan teachers, right? These Vajrayana masters, they think on vast timescales. They don't think they're not really bothered by some people kind of taking some Vajrayana teachings and then turning it into commercial fluff. I mean, they see kind of the bigger picture, right? These ideas are spreading to the West, and we're talking about them. Many people are practicing them. There are many Neo Tantra schools that are existing next to each other. They all talk about love and light, and they hate each other. It's so much fun.
yeah, that's right. Well, the love and light thing. I mean, we got
to ever see people
that's really
fight
gross
among
when that
each
happens.
other as people who go on about love and light all the time. It's like that was one of the most.
They're the worst kinds.
Exploring these circles, that was one of the first things that I discovered, that they're all fighting with each other, and they should be collaborating because they're trying to develop a technology that is alien and new in the West. And I find it a fascinating bunch of. So I always try to kind of see the good thing. Okay, you do a tantric cuddle workshop. Okay, well, at least you're trying to do something. At least you're trying to develop something. So I'm kind of a bit careful with judging people because it's too commercial or because it's dumbed down, or I like when people try out stuff. It's a bit like Borderland and Burning Man, right? I mean, many initiatives and camps, they're not worth much, but some are brilliant, and it's in that creative chaos that you get innovation.
Yeah, and those cultures, though, when they do work, they practice some form of barred absolute. So you have a threshold for people to get engaged. And the great thing with burner culture is that you can have a lot of woke people out there attack Burning Man all the time and attack the Borderland and all these festivals, but they don't show up to the festivals because woke people are lazy. So woke people sit, with their keyboards and have tons of opinions of what other people are up to. But at the end of the day, when you go to a burn, it only has one principle. It's called duocracy. The principle is that whoever shows up at the festival builds whatever they want to build. If they want to build a fucking death camp, they will do so. And that's the only thing that counts. And that's what the barred absolute is. A barred absolute is like, it's difficult to get there. And once you're there, you need to take responsibility for yourself. Otherwise, you don't survive. You need to fix your own shit. You need to fix your own food, your own shelter, whatever. You cannot pay your way through it and nobody else will do it for you. So because of those principles, which are exactly what barred absolutes are, I think we have a certain tantric element there, sort of early tantric development that I find incredibly interesting. Yeah. And I'm not surprised at all. You can have kids filling one end of a burn and you can have a sex camp at the other end of the burn. And hopefully they don't run into each other the same hours of the same day. But, it's the fact that you have that variety at a burn shows that these guys can keep the sutric and the tantric separate in a sort of very simple way, but it works.
Yeah.
So this is why I'm a strong proponent of barred absolutes. And I think that anything that claims to be tantric, but it's just perfectly open to anybody can go through the door, it's easy to get in. You hardly cost you anything. That's not tantra. Because that is
by definition, that's not tantra, because tantra is the secret practices. You can't, you have to. Again, and this is so I kind of defending a bit of traditionalism here, while wanting to accept that, the whole creative spirit as well. There should be Burning Man, and there should be small communities that are much more traditional where you do the preliminaries. That's what I argue with Thomas about, because you say, oh no, Western people shouldn't do the preliminaries. But where did that idea come from? It came from Tibetans who think they're superior to Western people, and these practices are for who can do them, and that's human beings. There's a kind of universal thing, and so some people might want to do the traditional.
Trungpa let people do meditation instead of these prostrations.
But when you started, but they were not tantric.
Sure that
they were not tantric. They were doing sutra. As soon as you got into tantra, you did prostration.
I love prostration.
No.
just not a technology that you're going to use on a massive scale, right? I mean,
no, definitely not. Well, exactly. That's why I'm saying there should be small communities of people doing that, and then there should also be larger communities of people who are, much more.
I mean, people in the West, they have done their 1,000 prostrations. That's something that teaches you stamina, motivation. That something that you learn how to become a systematic person that can basically do something that takes effort. Most of the Westerners do that all the time. We are like extremely trained. I mean, if you do something like, for example, mathematics and something very, very precise, and it requires a lot of training, a lot of concentration, a lot of effort. That's very, very similar to what these.
Wrong, absolutely wrong. Because Tantra is.
That's why I think that this is not a key practice.
I'm not talking just about prostrations. Have a specific result and a specific thing that happens when you do them. There's a goal to them, and that you have that result. It's not the same thing as something else. It's that thing in itself, right? Arguing that Western people can't do these things is like saying Western people are stupid. And they're no stupider than Tibetans or Chinese or Indians or.
There is something like, there's this is called spiritual materialism. Again, this is Trungpa, right? So you adopt these customs. And you people like to do something that's exotic. They like to be called, Swami Wamamananda, and this and that. They like to wear funny clothes. They like to do exotic rituals, right? And you have to be very careful with kind of mistaking doing something transformational and something useful with I'm just doing something that's exotic, and you're just replacing exoteric Christianity with exoteric Buddhism, right?
Exactly.
Now, I'm not saying that
exactly.
I agree that somebody. The 100,000 prostrations can be the best practice that somebody can ever do in certain circumstances. This is just not something that if you look at things like Tummo meditation and Salung and all these other things, and there's this, or Wim Hof. Imagine that Wim Hof said, first you need to do 100,000 prostrations before you can do.
Well, what he did, he was doing running marathons in the Arctic, wasn't he? Like swimming under cold frozen water and going in ice cube. He was doing all kinds of things before he developed
there is an intensity to modern life that I don't think anybody's willing to compromise on. And the price we pay for that intensity is that we tend to be more infantile and have a far less impulse control than we probably had, say, 300 years ago. So I think that's just a modern condition. I don't think anybody's willing to compromise on it because we believe we're going to die when we die. And, very Zoroastrian here, because we believe we're going to die when we die, we want to live a full life to its full capacity, full intensity, travel around the world, do tons of different things, and have many partners, and go through tons of shit before we die. So we don't want to repeat the same thing every day because we really do, after Freud, consider that to be death drive and not really libido. So, but the problem with that libido is that I think we need to be honest with ourselves and realize to be very sort of intensity libido driven, especially if we're smart and clever and get our way in lives. And therefore, when we look at these traditions, if somebody comes to the door and says, you're going to lock yourself up there and sit on that mountain over there under specific circumstances for the next 70 years and probably die before that, but that's what you're going to do to get to the point where you desire to be. Well, that might have been an alternative in a very borderline valley in Tibet 2,000 years ago, when occasionally trade route opened up in between.
I totally disagree. I completely disagree because I know people who live in full-time solitary retreat, and are also artists and play. It's like there's no difference between human beings now and then. At all.
Oh,
in
definitely.
fact, I think we're even more able to do those practices.
No, Andrew, you're so naive. The technological environment we're surrounded by today is radically different from the medieval age.
It's a different environment.
Yeah, there are eccentrics out there who like to live on their own. We call them shamanoid people.
Yeah.
And some of them need to
but
live
Tantra
like
is uncompromising, so it doesn't adapt to the environment.
That's the stupidity of it. That's exactly when Neo Tantra occurred, because by being uncompromising, by you saying it's uncompromising, I don't know if that's true or not, but by saying it's uncompromising, then why the heck aren't you sitting there like in Herman? Why do you raise a family in France at the moment?
You don't adjust to
why did you give up on it?
Tantra doesn't adjust to the culture in some kind of compromising way. No, absolutely not. No chance.
But it should.
No, it shouldn't.
Everything else has
it could be fully Western, but it doesn't adapt to the culture.
It's not Western.
Because it's like if people knew what they were doing in
Tantra, this is not Western versus Eastern.
And
listen to me, Andrew. Listen to me, Andrew.
Yeah.
If you go to Japan today, if you go to Korea today, I know that anybody who works as Zen and Zen practices in those countries today know they live in a very different environment from what you had 2 generations ago. And they're definitely constantly working on turning and changing Zen and Zen to fit in with the times. Not changing the opinions or the ideology like Christian churches are doing, thinking they're going to get popular by, going for the woke crowd or going for these stupid ideas.
No, the practices in Zen are exactly the same.
No,
Ever.
No, they're not. No, because they don't believe in a Platonist fixed world. That is the Western idea here. The Western idea is that
the
things
traditions
must be
change
the same
over
at all
time, but they change not.
Traditions change all the time because the environment changes. So tantric practice, if anything, that's exactly why it's fascinating to make comparative studies.
It's both.
There's
something that doesn't change, and there's something that
Wait, Andrew.
Yeah.
Comparative, to begin with, landscape. So you can have synchronous landscapes that are different. You can live in a river valley, in a mountainous area, whatever, and your tantric practice will be different because of it. Of course, the tantric practice won't be the same everywhere on the planet. Now, if that is the case, if tantric practice can be different in a synchronous way, then why the hell wouldn't they in a vertical way be different too? Meaning that if the technological environment changes radically, then of course the practice would have to change.
Exactly. Yeah.
But something that works well for 15,000 years, you don't just change it willy-nilly. You don't do that because it works. It's been working for 15,000 years. It's like, let's take the church away from Christianity, or let's get rid of Christ. Let's get rid of the cross. It's like, let's get rid of all that's, there is a part that is.
Christianity is basically doing the same thing, right?
Yeah, but it's how is that working out for it? I mean,
that all of these things that you actually just said, literally, there are like, the death of God theology and all of that stuff. All religions constantly need to be updated for the present.
Yes.
Religions are very dynamical entities. And this was very, very, Trungpa showed that in a fantastic way. Just, walked in, dressed like an English gentleman and organizing these classical English dinners with meticulous cutlery and stuff like that. And that was his way of formulating Tantra in the 70s in America.
No, so but I was in that tradition, and it's like, it was absolutely traditional. At the same time as being absolutely radical.
Well, yeah, I agree. It was also
even more traditional than the Tibetans. Like, he went back to Sanskrit and he got people to study and actually do meditation, which they weren't even doing in Tibet. And he got them to, and the first thing you would do if you do the Tantra is the pre-preliminaries, and then the preliminaries. And as you couldn't do Tantra before that, you could do a lot of Sutra, So I'm saying there's a radicality and a tradition.
As David Chapman points out, if you now in the West go to one of the traditional Buddhist sects and organizations, then what you get is sutra with some singing and dance.
I agree with that. Yeah, but
so that means that this format is either seen as too risky or not possible, or the Westerners are not ready for it. But basically, the Tibetans do not really want to give it to the Westerners, right? And so the Westerners, they basically are developing it for themselves. That's basically what's happening right now, and this is going to take hundreds of years.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's going to blend with Christianity, and it's going to blend with also, we are going to, was another thing on our list, multiple perspectives. So basically, we are going to have a huge market of religions. So we're going to have a crosstalk between religions. We're going to have Christian Tantrics, and we're going to have Tantric Muslims and Sutric Christians and what have you. There's going to be an enormous creative chaos where and it's still in India, it's still like that, right? So that the boundaries between all these different religions are they're not so strict. There's not in terms of Christianity. We very quickly think, this. If you want to be a Christian, that's a straight and narrow, right? And if you deny some of these dogmatic truths, then you can't be a Christian, right? All that stuff is now disappearing. People don't look at Jordan Peterson.
Exactly. That's why I said that the fixated version of how things must be done is Western. I've never heard that in these. That's just extremely Western.
Okay. Yeah.
Platonist, Western. So it must be done in the clean, pure way, according to tradition, without exception. That is exactly why Islam and Christianity have fostered fundamentalism, and why we today have a secular fundamentalism called woke culture. So
I'm just saying I'm just saying something very simple. It's like you can't.
No.
Things behind it. You can't reinvent the wheel. You just can't do it.
Andrew, that's all my point. Listen, Andrew, shut up. Andrew, just for once, listen, okay? Because I am not a defender. I have never been a defender of shortcuts and quick fixes. Don't you dare say that I've ever proposed anything like that at all.
But that's what
That's
you guys are
not the
saying.
point.
How Westerners
That
are
point,
too-
no, the point is this one. When the first time I came to Mumbai and I saw a Zoroastrian mobed, a Parsi mobed, drink the pee from the bowl, I was just stupid enough to ask him, didn't you give the bull something to eat before you drank the pee? And he looked at me like, no, we don't talk about that. And it was completely empty ritual because it was done exactly the same way it's been done for thousands of years without compromise on the ritual, which means the ritual made no sense. Rituals that don't make sense are dead rituals. They're just dead religion.
I never disagreed with that.
A lot of shit dies because it becomes irrelevant, because it's nothing to do with the world we live in, and therefore there's no point in doing. But a lot of people like to do that because a lot of people have very neurotic inclination, and the people with neurotic inclination will then tell you, if you don't do it exactly the way it's supposed to be done and be done successfully for thousands of years, then you fail. Well, that's not relevant either.
No,
that's not relevant at all. You need to step back from the whole thing. That's time consuming. And then start studying what in all this is it that we were lacking and need to bring back in. So if I tie in it with Thomas's idea, which I completely agree on, we're going to have a huge market of religions more than ever. New Age was just the beginning of that, but hopefully more quality added to it. But I think we need also to understand what I love with the Persians, what they understood. You need an imperial order, and that's also religion. And that's what the Chinese think that Confucianism is the way forward. And since we don't seem to have any political ideologies left in the West, except for some woke shit that can't decide or rule anything, then of course the Chinese are just not looking terrified at America and Europe and saying, you don't have an idea of religious order that runs a society, which Confucianism does. Confucianism then leaves tantric practices to Taoism, which you do within Taoism, and you can start to do it in Buddhism. Although Buddhism in China has been more focused on other things that complement Taoism. So you have 3 different religions in China that have collaborated with each other, lived in parallel with each other for thousands of years in China. That's a model that I'm looking at the moment. But I think what we'll need to get is more the Persian order, where it's like you have a religion which is priestly, you have a religion which is royal, but then you have a folk religion which basically tolerates anything. And that is, free speech, freedom of thought, and that certainly should be the case when it comes to religion. And that's what we call iconology in our work. Iconology is basically you can worship any icon you like. That's up to you. And we respect you for that. It's your choice. And we prefer if the icons are local, because then you can tie them into with the local community and you can have your own affairs being settled. So in that sense, I believe everything is religion, and religion is everything, in the sense that society is religious all the way through. I just think political ideologies are crap religions because they don't realize there are religions. That's exactly why they fail. And they haven't thought through what they should do. They shortcuts, quick fixes and shit like that. And then when you look at the overall map, tantric practice is essentially, okay, so you're a bit special here, you're a bit odd. You're ready to spend far more energy and time in your life on going into the tantric realm than other people might even not dare to or are not ready for. So you go through that whole process, you become an expert on it because you happen to have a shamanoid personality. That is certainly what you should do, because then that's your archetype. And that's certainly where Tantra will start and grow deeper and more sincere and get better and will reinvent itself. And then, like any renaissance, it is both reborn and it's fresh and new at the same time.
Yeah. So I have absolutely zero, I think Tantra absolutely has to reinvent itself all the time. And it's a dynamic process that's always reinventing stuff. I'm not saying that there should be some sort of dogma and this is the way you should do it. I'm just saying that it's a fallacy to think that because of the way that Western people are, that they can't do that sort of thing, because I know that not to be true. so that's all I'm saying.
I don't think anybody said it in that way. Why wouldn't you be able to do super traditional Vajrayana in the West or
This is what the Tibetans tell people all the time, and it's a kind of propaganda. It's saying that, oh no, Westerners, they're too materialistic and commercial, and they can't do these hard practices that we can do because we're so pure and spiritual, and that's what I'm arguing.
Yeah, I remember.
I'm arguing against the conservatism. You guys are accusing me of conservatism.
A Buddhist teacher, and that was like a 3-day insult of the West. Yeah, you Westerners, and you're so greedy, and you're so lazy.
Yeah, I know. I know. Yeah.
3 days.
Well, I guess they're just as racist as everybody else is when it comes down to it.
Yep.
So.
Well, it was very amusing. I thought it was hilarious, actually. He
Yeah.
did it very.
Well, it's not like the Indians or the Japanese or the Chinese or the Koreans don't think very highly of themselves and look down at everybody else, including their own neighbors. That is East Asia. So you find tons.
Well, I mean, isn't the world becoming like? I mean, this is the age of the digital empire, right? The network. I mean, all of these differences are disappearing more and more. There's like this one big spread of know-how and psychotechnologies and anthropologies and ways of being and ways of living, and it's just spreading all over the world. So the only thing so we will see the great splintering, right? Small groups of people who come together and decide this is how we want to live, and there needs to be some kind of network of networks that makes that possible. So,
yeah, well, Greg, who wrote this book, was telling me, why he wrote this book is because he wants to move Tantra from the East to the West to say that it's perfectly like legitimate here, right? And there's all kinds of like.
Listen to your Greg interview. Isn't it a good example? So he basically took some traditional teachings and he's blending it now. So he talks a lot about other esoteric traditions and Master Eckhart and what have you, and he blends that with the Buddhist Nandro. And that's in his book. So that's again, reformulation, bringing things up to date, adding new elements, being creative, trying out some new stuff. But what I did notice that this Greg lives a monastic life, right? He lives in a monastery, essentially with a sangha. So that was very apparent from your talk.
He's married. He has two kids.
That was his path, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's not that's fine. But the question is, if you are, let's say you are a very busy professional, you're I don't know, you're designing AI algorithms for a big company, and you have a family, and you raise children and all of that stuff. What kind of practices are you going to do? You don't have time to kind of spend 20 years doing your prostrations and then hope that you'll get out of on the other side as a better person or even enlightened. You want something that works here and now. In your busy Western life.
But then you could go for Zoroastrianism or Judaism because their urban religions have been urban for a long time and been adapted to urban environments.
You can do that. I mean, you can. Yeah. I think that there are many options now. I think that there's so many things you can do now. So you have to kind of, to some extent, because the institutions have collapsed or are less powerful than before. A lot of people are filling in the vacuum. They're developing new approaches. Especially in Christianity, there's so many young people who are trying to, they come together in these communities, and we were going to meet some of them at the European Men's Gathering. The new view takes on Christianity, and the same is happening with Buddhism and all the other religions. It's a very creative and interesting period, and so far, surprisingly little violence, given the enormous amount of change. That was a bit different during the Reformation.
Well, we did have sort of an inoculation with Islamic fundamentalism quite recently. And we did have Christian fundamentalism in America quite heavily before that too. So I think we know what we don't want. And that's interesting in the Middle East, actually. Islam is probably stronger now in Europe than it is in the Middle East, in the sense that there's a whole young generation in the Middle East who basically... They hate the Islamic State, and they look down on like this idiocy, like what the fuck was this, right? And they don't want to be part of that, so they either go for some form of moderate, more cosmopolitan version of Islam, and they of course have rich tradition in Islam's history where they can pick up on that, or they just for example, Iraq, they leave Islam altogether and they convert and they pick another, usually older or parallel religion that they could actually defend, that hasn't gone fundamentalist over the last 50 years and therefore created the havoc that Islam did. So the longer the Shia versus Sunni conflicts and the longer Iran and Saudi Arabia are mismanagement or run by dictatorships, the worse, of course, the reputation of Islam will be. But that is also an immunization against religious fundamentalism. I would say that the scariest forms of fundamentalism today are no longer even Islamic. I would say the scariest forms of fundamentalism today are Chinese communists and woke.
Yeah.
And they scare me more because they're more popular now. They're more widespread, and they can both go violent. China is arming itself to its teeth, and it's now basically ready to fight everybody else because it doesn't have any allies. Nobody wants to be an ally with China unless you're forced to. Communist China has never convinced anybody out of love to have a relationship with them. They're basically, communist China is basically becoming the bully head of the world, running around trying to bullying everybody and forcing them into somehow falling to the power of the Chinese Communist Party when nobody wants to be part of it. And of course, woke culture is very similar. It's not loved by anybody, but it's forcing its way in through the doors, putting its foot inside the door, and claims that it has a right to be there, and has a right to privilege, has a right to, repatriation, all kinds of shit, without adding any creative value whatsoever to any discourse. Those are the fundamentalisms we deal with now. And I think we need religion to stand up against them, because you can't be sort of a secular nihilist atheist and stand up against the woke people. You can't. You got to go into heroic mode and defend a heroic position, which is a religious position, which is a tantric, Nietzschean position, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So we need religion more than ever, because we cannot respond to these other movements. Why would you even respond to Xi Jinping's dictatorship in China when he says that my system works, we're creating enormous economic benefits, the economy is growing all the time, building a strong military, we will never give up on Tibet and Xinjiang, we'll keep them forever, whatever. And he says this is a winning model. So why would we tolerate dissent in the system? Because the dissent in itself has no value to the system, which means we need to prove that our idea that diversity of opinion within religion is the way forward, because it becomes a better, more productive system in the long run.
Yeah.
We can't go around with moralism arguing against Chinese communism. Like with all fundamentalists, the only way you can beat the shit out of them is proving that your system will not work in the long run.
Yeah.
We have a more resilient system, will work longer and create more benefits long term than your system will do. And that is exactly what the Persian imperial order against the Chinese imperial order is about. The Persian imperial order being that by putting sex third, and by putting king versus priest first, and also differentiate between hunt and war, which means killing a human is very different from killing an animal. By making those distinctions before you go into the sexual realm, you actually create something that I believe is a better sort of tantric imperial order that could work as the overall religion.
There are some empires, I think in India, that actually had the Tantra state religion.
Yes.
So that's something.
I think Bhutan is still considers itself to be a Vajrayana country or something.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong about that, but
these were empires that were very much so they were warrior empires, did a lot of wars and stuff like that. So all this Maha Yoga practice, visualizing fierce deities and stuff like that. So Father Tantra. And that was the state religion. So it was it was kind of a unity there, right? So that must have been
there's this mythical character Gesar of Ling, who's this fierce warrior of he's
the Shambhala,
he's
right?
the empire, he's the imperial general or something, and put it in the tantric iconography. But he's very important.
You got a lot of that. You got the. Just checking them here. Yeah.
Gesar of Ling.
Yeah, you had a very strong period about 1,000 years ago. You had a couple of those local Indian empires that actually were run according to tantric practices as well.
I mean, you could look at this as the tantric types. This is a bit esoteric of a subject. But.
Well, you know about Khajuraho, for example, huh? Khajuraho, you can even fly into Khajuraho today. It has its own airport and everything. So Khajuraho is this place in northern India which is full of these sex temples, which is orgy after orgy after orgy, and you walk for like kilometers and these walls and walls and walls. And that was built during an era. This is close to Varanasi. So this is built during an area where actually northern India was run through as a tantric empire. So they have these tantric cults and they were run that way. And I think sex and violence were prevalent at the forefront of those cults. And you probably find very similar phenomena in Mesoamerica. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually both sex and violence and drugs that are at the forefront of those cultures, at least for a while, which is very expressive, I would say. It's very Nietzschean, very Deleuzian. And, as long as there are no Sibelian woke cults around, it's perfectly fine if you prefer to live in a sort of more pro-tantric environment like that. But yeah, there have been tantric empires, certainly in Mexico and in India. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think we would prefer to have our tantric practices more local for now and keep them local for now. We believe in the Bard Absolute. We believe that people need to be of a certain personal disposition.
Yeah, that's an
They need a certain background.
I agree with the Bard Absolute so it's a bit like climbing a mountain, right? You do it because it's difficult and you're going to be challenged and stuff like that. So people who are you should be prepared for that.
Yes.
You know, when you're doing a Wim Hof workshop, the water is going to be cold. In fact, it's going to be freezing. And so it should be clarified to people who start on these types of practices up front to make sure that those who are not suitable to do these practices don't enter. And I think that's indeed very, very important. So that Bard Absolute is a good concept for that. And that's maybe something that you could say. How can you recognize a genuine Tantra? And that is, in some sense, this Bard Absolute.
Strong Bard Absolute, yeah.
Yeah. So if
Definitely.
this is something that is completely innocent and anybody can join, and it's only about meditation and nothing scary, and then I don't know what you're doing, but that's very difficult to call that Tantra in any meaningful sense of the word.
Well, we can give an example. I think we're going to have a lot of psychedelic retreats that will be legal in, say, 10 years' time, both in Europe and North America.
Yeah.
I hope these psychedelic retreats won't just be like Silicon Valley big tech companies that they just want to make the biggest possible profit and sell the product to anybody who wants to buy it. And you go through the door to one of these retreats and they give you 40 tons of drugs as long as you pay for them. Now, I hope we get some kind of a Bard Absolute introduced here where there's a certain culture that, we have an expectation that you're ready for this experience, you're ready for that experience, or actually that experience you might desire, but it's absolutely meaningless to you and really dangerous. You should try to avoid that. The way we do with, say, medication. It's just like, if you don't have some kind of a licensing system tied to this and no Bard Absolute introduced it will cause havoc. I can understand why people are very skeptical.
This comes back also to the idea that you need a guide. In Tantra, you absolutely need a guide. You can't make it up on your own terms.
That's why I'm always emphasizing that I love capitalism, because capitalism is like an abstract, phallic force that has blown itself through humanity for 700 years and created enormous wealth and benefits because of it. But this is the time in history when we need to identify what is not for sale. And exactly that's where the Bard Absolute comes into the picture. You cannot cross the Bard Absolute because you paid your way in. No, you can only cross the Bard Absolute because you're ready for it. And this is the right thing for you to do because it will create wealth and value for others around you. Yeah. Now,
and you have the intrinsic character, and you've done the preliminaries, and you've.
And you read Whitehead's Process and Reality, and you memorized several chapters.
That's just being a geek.
You jerked off to the porn version of Process and Reality. That's what you did. So that's probably right. That's a good
being
note.
Being a nerd doesn't qualify you.
I mean, guys, I love these conversations. We can go on forever about Chakdam Trungpa and Trungpa and Kepa and all these guys. Thank you, guys, for introducing me to the world of Vajrayana Buddhism.
Generalized Buddhist Tantra, I would say. I mean, I'm not really a traditional Vajrayana practitioner, although I did quite a bit of training in traditional methods. But I'm very eclectic. I really like to do very different things, and then so like, whoa, this Neo Tantra practice looks completely different from anything that I know with respect to traditional Tantra, and then you start thinking, right? Well, wait a minute. Aren't they exactly trying to accomplish the same thing? Isn't this basically kind of a more accessible reformulation? I find that so I do that with philosophy as well. Often it's like, aren't there any common underlying goals, common underlying ideas that come out in very different ways? And that's why, I mean, often I see people in all these Neo Tantra communities and stuff like that. They do a lot of interesting stuff. And often also, so you start doing something that is maybe very accessible and maybe doesn't have a lot of Bard Absolute, but I mean, people come from all kinds of walks of life, right? So for some people, a cuddle workshop is extremely boundary crossing, and well, then that's a good preliminary practice for them. Sure. Why not?
Yeah,
definitely.
So then you have all these, basically you have this pattern, right? And then you stay involved with something, and you get. So for example, so I got introduced to Buddhism via via, let's say, organizations that didn't really have to do much with Buddhism. But then I started reading about Hinduism, and that didn't really speak to me as much as Buddhism. And I really went into Buddhism, and that's what's happening now on a large scale in the West, right? Massive exploration and exchange of information, where if you want to find out this, you can go there. And I think one of the best examples is Wim Hof. I'm a big Wim Hof fan. He basically took this idea from Anu Yoga, from Tantric Buddhism, and then made it very accessible. But at the same time, Wim Hof has a barred absolute, right? I mean, it requires discipline. It requires you need to be able to sit there in that ice bath without whining and stuff like that. So and it works, and it's challenging, and it transforms the body. It's now there's even scientific applications about it. This is a prime example of the great stuff that is happening now.
Yeah, I think if you're studying, religion, or if you're studying in a tantric school or something like that, like I'm doing, that you should study all the religions, really. And that's what's particular about the school that I study in is that you learn from all the different religions, and then you practice this one thing, right? So I think that's the future too. Also, it's not this narrow, puritanical sort of, closed kind of communities, but something where you're open to all the traditions, and you're trying to find
in a way, because
but you're practicing one.
But also a lot of these traditions have contradictions, and we don't buy contradictions any longer.
No, I'm not saying you don't criticize them. I'm saying that.
But this is my point.
You become a cosmopolitan thinker,
because the systems have been sort of built like layer upon layer, and they have been part of power structures. And because they're part of power structures, they've been diverged in certain ways to serve certain purposes, and that's how they made the resources. That's quite natural. I'm for one of these guys who believes that the purity of religion exists for about a second after it got started, and something like that. And already then, of course, it was full of contradictions, like Hewell said. And these contradictions are precisely, I would say, for me, the reason why I go into theology and go into philosophy and study religion and do comparative studies. And the only thing I can really judge them by, in a sort of general sense that makes sense to readers and people who participate in my work, is by basically doing culture studies. So, do these religions work in the long run? Do they create value and wealth for their communities? And do they, what kind of values do they defend in that case? And is it sustainable or not? And that's what I'm interested in. I am interested in killing racism, killing sexism and everything, and just look at people as these biological evolution developed two-gendered creatures who then, in different parts of the world, have had certain practices that became certain cultures, and some of these cultures became more successful and some were not. And then you can also do them differently. Certainly the cultures that could say that they were commercially more successful, some were spiritually more successful, some were more successful when it comes to overall knowledge or whatever. Some became more tolerant towards strangers than other cultures did, which is probably a big plus. You can make all these comparisons if you like. You can choose between those. And that's where I think this variety and this diversity of opinion comes into the picture. But at the end of the day, it should all be fact-oriented. And certainly, you should be held accountable for when you're presenting contradictions. Contradictions are often a way to say something flattering and make a shortcut in your argumentation. That's why they should be exposed. And a lot of spiritual teaching is exactly about that. Where are your shortcuts and quick fixes, darling? Oh, so you thought you could jump through this and get there that quickly? Won't work, because you're taking your contradictions with you. You need to get rid of those first before you can step into the light and take the next step.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. Yeah. Great, guys. We'll finish with this one. I'm sure we come up with a crazy idea soon to do something else, but I'm perfectly happy with this, and I'm going to continue my studies, and we'll see where that leads. I'm certainly going back to the Sweat Valley as soon as I can. I loved being there. And Kashmiri Shaivism, that's where it's at in India for me.
I like Amsterdam.
Amsterdam.
You're so grounded, Thomas. I'll see you in Amsterdam soon. Yeah. Okay? Big love, guys.
Thanks so much.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Yes.
Have a good one.